This is Politics UK. I'm Leila Nathoo. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent, Sean Curran. On the programme this week, chaos and confusion in the House of Commons after the Speaker allows a Labour amendment to the SNP's motion on a ceasefire in Gaza.
Where on earth is the Speaker of the House of Commons? How do we bring him to that seat?
I apologise for a decision that didn't end up in the place that I wished for.
A row erupts over the sacking of the former Post Office chairman Henry Staunton. The Business Secretary Kemi Badenoch accuses him of lying.
He's chosen to spread a series of falsehoods, provide made-up anecdotes to journalists and leak discussions held in confidence.
The last thing that was needed in this scandal was any further allegations of cover-ups or obfuscation at the very top of government.
The dispute over Mr Staunton's claims about who said what to whom goes on to dominate Prime Minister's questions.
Would the Prime Minister be prepared personally to repeat the allegation made by his Business Secretary that the former chair of the Post Office is lying?
She asked Henry Staunton to step down after serious concerns were raised. She set out the reasons for this and the full background in the House earlier this week.
And Scotland decides to ban XL bully dogs, matching restrictions in England and Wales. Hello. Well, calls for a ceasefire in the war in Gaza dominated the week in Westminster. The SNP tabled a motion in Parliament on Wednesday, and amendments to it were proposed by both the government and the Labour Party. But the House of Commons descended into chaos during the debate, resulting in a walkout by some MPs. Sean, tell us what caused this almighty row.
So this is a row essentially about procedure and the rules, the day-to-day business of the Commons. And the anger is because some MPs from the SNP and the Conservatives think the rules aren't being applied in a fair way. So, as you say, the SNP, they get a few chances during the course of a year to choose the subject for debate. They had put forward a motion calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. What normally happens is that the government would then put forward an amendment, and at the end of the debate there'd be two votes. The first one would be on the opposition party's arguments, in this case the SNP, and then, if that was knocked down, there'd be a vote on the government. Sir Lindsay Hoyle announced at the start of the debate that he was going to break with the past and allow Labour to table an amendment. So that not only changed the order of the votes, but it broke with the way that things had been done in the past. And that angered some Conservatives. It certainly angered the SNP. They were accusing Sir Lindsay Hoyle of basically taking a decision in order to favour the Labour Party. And that has led not only to the rowdy scenes, which we will see in a minute, and they were genuinely very angry, rowdy, chaotic scenes, but it has also led for some MPs to call on the Speaker to resign.
Mr Speaker has stated in the decision that he has taken today, and that he is entitled to take, that he wished for all propositions on the order paper to be put to the House. However, this decision has raised temperatures in this House on an issue where feelings are already running high, and this has put honourable and right honourable members in a more difficult position. The consequences may be that government is not able to respond to opposition day motions, and as such, the government does not have confidence that it will be able to vote on its own motion. For that reason, the government will play no further part in the decision this House takes on today's proceedings.
They have an amendment in their name, which they obviously clearly don't have the numbers to now get through this House, because, and it's astonishing, really, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the party opposite are now suddenly finding themselves standing in defence of the Scottish Nationalist Party.
Can you please advise me, where on earth is the Speaker of the House of Commons? How do we bring him to that seat to explain, how do we bring him to this House now to explain to the Scottish National Party why our views and our votes in this House are irrelevant to him?
There were going to be, as I understood it, 3 votes tonight. The government has withdrawn from that. The consequence is, as the Right Honourable Gentleman says, that if the Labour Party amendment is passed, it is then added to the SNP motions. You will listen to the points of order and listen politely. It looks so bad on such an important issue. And no point in shouting me down now. To our constituents, if they just see people who are raising perfectly reasonable points of order, that they're just shouted down. Not good. Not good.
It was my wish to do the best by every member of this House. I was very concerned, I am still concerned, and that's why the meetings I've had today is about the security of members, their families, and the people that are involved. I am honest to this House, I am true to this House, I believe in all members of this House, and I have tried to do what I thought was the right thing for all sides of this House. It is regrettable, and I apologise for a decision that didn't end up in the place that I wished for.
The Speaker there, Sir Lindsay Hall, trying to explain his decision that led to those extraordinary scenes. Sean, many thanks for now. We will be back with you later in the programme. But to Edinburgh and our Scotland political correspondent, David Henderson, who's at the Scottish Parliament in Holyrood. David, First Minister's questions this week saw clashes over Scotland's health service and the way the SNP is managing it. What point are the opposition parties trying to make?
Well, that's right. This was the usual weekly set-piece debate between the SNP's First Minister Humza Yousaf and opposition leaders. This week, the Scottish Conservatives focused very much on the NHS and a report by the spending watchdog Audit Scotland on its future. The report warns that Scotland's NHS is unable to cope with growing demand. It warns of patients waiting too long to be seen, and that, as you can imagine, prompted a healthy debate.
There is no vision for Scotland's NHS. Not my words, but the words of the Auditor-General for Scotland. And they make it very clear that the lack of vision has not just happened because of the pandemic and the issues that our NHS faced. There has not been a vision for Scotland's NHS since 2013. There's been a lost decade of leadership in Scotland's NHS. 10 years of stalling and delay has had dire consequences for patients. How long are people in Scotland going to have to wait for the SNP to get their act together?
Officer are investing in that recovery now. That's why, for example, those outpatients waiting the longest has reduced by almost 70%. That's why inpatients waiting the longest have reduced by over 25%. It's why operations performed in the last 12 months have increased by 11%. It's why, through our investment, we've created additional capacity for 20,000 procedures. It's why we're investing a record £19.5 billion in our NHS, despite the fact that the UK government, in their autumn statement, provided less than £11 million for NHS health consequentials. That's enough to fund 5 hours of NHS activity, Presiding Officer.
Well, this exchange underlines just how the SNP and the Conservatives particularly clash at First Minister's questions. The Conservatives tend to focus on bread and butter issues like health and education and say that the SNP are not delivering. The First Minister tends to respond in a standard way by reminding Conservatives that ultimately his government relies on Westminster for much of its funding. So if they are unhappy with public services here in Scotland, they should go and speak to their boss in number 10, Rishi Sunak.
And David, Scotland has now followed the rest of the UK in imposing restrictions on XL bully dogs, but that has actually caused a row between Holyrood and Westminster. Why is that?
Well, we've heard much in recent months, haven't we, about the dangers from XL bullies, these large and sometimes aggressive dogs. You'll recall that a spate of attacks in England last year prompted the UK government to act and introduce an effective ban, taking effect from the start of the year. The same restrictions were not introduced in Scotland at the time, largely because they were not seen to be as much of a problem here as in England. But what we did see almost immediately was that XL bully dogs were being transported across the border from England into Scotland for rehoming. One man boasted that he'd moved dozens of dogs across from England into Scotland in his van. And the Scottish government ultimately responded by imposing a ban of their own, taking effect quite recently. And MSPs have been discussing the rights and wrongs of it. But one senior SNP MSP said that this all raised a rather difficult question. What is an XL bully anyway?
I think one of the things that we had concerns about initially with the announcement of the ban down south was this loophole, which we were trying to get certainty on, which we didn't get until the 12th or the 14th of December, sorry, I can't remember the exact date now. And I think that was the reason that we did have concerns, and that's when I wrote my letter on the 14th of November. And I did feel confident at that stage that on the 31st of December, because we've got the dog control notices through the local authorities who have the powers to deal with dangerous dogs locally, that we were really in the same position as England and Wales. I think what we didn't envisage was people bringing up XL bully dogs during the Christmas period, and then obviously community safety has to be paramount, and this is why this decision's been made.
Is it not a basic principle of law that it should be clear and understood, but not confused?
That's what we're trying to do through the Scottish website as we move forward with this legislation.
Well, Minister, I would challenge you that, and I'm not laying the fault here, we're replicating something in England, but what was wrong, it's wrong in England as well, by the way. It's not bad law there, it's bad law here, if it comes into force, is that you cannot unravel this, because we come to the kernel of this, which is what is a bully XL, and nobody in this room can actually give a clear, simple definition. And that's key to any legislation, particularly when you're taking away people's rights, particularly when you're criminalising them, particularly when animals are going to be put down or dumped by people who don't do it. And it's for a few, not the many here.
Well, this XL bully story is seen by some as a bit of a lesson in how devolution works, or rather it doesn't work, and what happens when you impose a ban in one part of the country but not another. And that committee hearing also highlights the ongoing tensions between the UK government and the Scottish government, because ministers here claim that they got absolutely no advanced warning about the introduction of these restrictions from their UK counterparts. And the first they learnt of it was reading it on the BBC website. But we've also heard that Scottish ministers then did not contact their UK ministerial counterparts to ask for the law to be changed or for a cross-border ban to be introduced either. It's all a bit of a reminder that the relationship between Holyrood and Westminster can at times be fraught.
Very interesting. And just before you go, David, we have seen the Scottish Parliament approve changes to the ministerial team in the Scottish Government. Just talk us through who's up and who's down.
Well, That's right. That was prompted by a whiff of scandal, the resignation of the Scottish Health Secretary Michael Matheson a couple of weeks ago. He was under investigation by parliamentary authorities over a huge expenses bill run up during a holiday last year, a family holiday. He run up a bill of £11,000 in roaming charges on his parliamentary iPad. Now, at first, that bill was met by the Parliament on his word. He then backtracked, he paid back the money, and he apologised to MSPs and admitted his sons had run up the bill watching football. Now, Mr Matheson eventually stood down. That's prompted a mini reshuffle, and under Scottish parliamentary rules, those positions have to be approved by MSPs after debate.
For the First Minister, this reshuffle was a missed opportunity to reset his failing leadership, a missed opportunity to regain control of the agenda, a missed opportunity to kick the Greens into touch. And he ducked it because the green tail continues to wag the SNP dog.
Let us hear Mr Hoy.
Regardless of how far and how fast she falls, this is still a government which cannot escape the long shadow cast by Nicola Sturgeon.
This is an important day, particularly for those that are entering government for the first time. And for literally 5 minutes, all you have to do really is rise to the occasion. And Craig Hoy singularly failed to do that. No wonder, Presiding Officer, we heard cries of "Bring back Jackson, bring back Jackson." And I fully endorse those cries. Though I do get it, Presiding Officer, Craig Hoy really has no hope of ministerial office unless he donates to the Tory party. He might well become a Lord and then, of course, be brought back into the Scotland office. Who knows? That might well happen to him.
So this brings changes to Humza Yousaf's team at Holyrood. He loses the highly experienced Michael Matheson, but he's able to promote some of his supporters. It means that the Scottish Cabinet now has 7 women out of 10 members. There's another significant appointment. Kokab Stewart becomes the first woman of colour to become a Scottish minister. And we're hearing a new message too from the Scottish Government after this mini reshuffle. The new Health Secretary, Neil Gray, has talked of the need to reform the NHS. That's something we've not heard much about in recent years here in Scotland, but it reflects real pressure on the NHS here and real pressure on the Scottish Government to be seen to be doing something about it.
Some notable changes there then, David. David Henderson, many thanks at Holyrood. Well, back to Westminster. Our parliamentary correspondent, Sean Curran, is still here with us. Sean, the row over the Post Office scandal rumbled on this week, actually got deeper. The sacked former chairman of the Post Office, Henry Staunton, made some claims about delays to payments to wrongly accused postmasters. The business secretary hit back at him by accusing him of falsehoods. Just how did we get here?
Yeah, so this is a new aspect to the row about the Horizon IT scandal. As you say, Henry Staunton gave an interview to the Sunday Times. He made a series of claims, and it is fair to say that the business secretary, Kemi Badenoch, was extremely angry. So angry, in fact, that she came to the Commons on Monday to deny them in quite colourful terms.
It is so disappointing that he's chosen to spread a series of falsehoods, provide made-up anecdotes to journalists, and leak discussions held in confidence. All of this merely confirms in my mind that I made the correct decision in dismissing him. Mr. Staunton claimed I told him that someone's got to take the rap for the Horizon scandal, and that was the reason for his dismissal. That was not the reason at all. I dismissed him because there were serious concerns about his behaviour as chair, including those raised from other directors on the board. I should also inform the House that while he was in post, a formal investigation was launched into allegations made regarding Mr. Staunton's conduct. This included serious matters such as bullying. Finally, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Staunton claimed that when he was first appointed as chair of the Post Office, he was told by a senior civil servant to stall on paying compensation. There is no evidence whatsoever that this is true. I would hope that most people reading the interview in yesterday's Sunday Times would see it for what it was, a blatant attempt to seek revenge following dismissal.
I cannot stress enough how the last thing that was needed in this scandal was any further allegations of cover-ups or obfuscation at the very top of government. People's faith in government, already damaged from scandals like Hillsborough and Bloody Sunday and Windrush, is hanging by a thread. And this miscarriage of justice has shown the devastation that can occur when institutions are allowed to operate without oversight or are shrouded by secrecy.
There's been talk all morning about damaging confidence in the compensation schemes. If there is confidence in the compensation schemes, can the Secretary of State explain to me why so many leading sub-postmasters who were affected by this scandal were given such derisory offers months and months and months late? That's just not on. So you can't say that Henry Staunton damaged the compensation schemes. That's government. That's Post Office Limited.
That wasn't the end of the story, was it, Sean? Because the row also spilled over into PMQs in the middle of the week.
That's right. It was a slightly different Prime Minister's questions from the more recent ones. It was a little bit more low-key. But Sir Keir Starmer began focusing in on what Kemi Badenoch had been telling MPs at the start of the week.
Would the Prime Minister be prepared personally to repeat the allegation made by his business secretary that the former chair of the Post Office is lying when he says he was told to go slow on compensation for postmasters and limp to the next election?
Mr. Speaker, as the Business Secretary said on Monday, she asked Henry Staunton to step down after serious concerns were raised. She set out the reasons for this and the full background in the House earlier this week. But importantly, we have also taken unprecedented steps to ensure that victims of the Horizon scandal do receive compensation as swiftly as possible and in full. Making sure that victims receive justice and compensation remains our #1 priority, and we will shortly bring forward legislation to address this matter soon.
I'm not sure that takes us very much further forward, so let me press on, because on Monday the Business Secretary also confirmed categorically that the Post Office was, and I'll quote this in fairness to the Prime Minister, at no point told to delay compensation payments by either an official or a minister from any government department, and at no point was it suggested that a delay would be of benefit to the Treasury. So that's Monday. A note released by the former Post Office chair this morning appears to directly contradict that. I appreciate that the Business Secretary has put the Prime Minister in a tricky position, but will he commit to investigating this matter properly, including whether that categorical statement was correct and why, rather than taking those accusations seriously, she accused a whistleblower of lying?
Mr. Speaker, it is worth bearing in mind that, as the Business Secretary said on Monday, she asked Henry Staunton to step down after serious concerns were raised. But this is, on a matter of substance, one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in our nation's history, because people who were working hard serving their communities had their lives and reputations destroyed, and that's why we are working hard to ensure that they get justice and compensation, and that's why we established Sir Win Williams' inquiry. It's why we've already paid out over £150 million of compensation to almost 3,000 victims, and it's why we will introduce new legislation shortly to exonerate those. We will make sure that we do what is needed, that the truth does come to light, we right the wrongs of the past, and crucially, that victims get the justice that they deserve.
As it stands, some 60% of the buildings in Gaza are either damaged or destroyed. Much of the farmland is in ruin. Some 30,000 people are dead, 70,000 injured, and 1.4 million people are currently sheltering in Rafah, awaiting an imminent Israeli onslaught. Surely the Prime Minister must accept that that does not amount to self-defence.
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I share the concern of many members about the high rate of civilian casualties and indeed the growing humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and that is why we have called consistently for an immediate humanitarian pause, which would allow for the safe release of hostages and more aid going into Gaza so that we create the sustainable conditions for a long-term and enduring ceasefire. That is what our diplomatic efforts are focused on, and that is what I impressed upon the Israeli Prime Minister last week when I spoke to him.
Prime Minister's questions there. Sean, many thanks for now. We will be back with you a little bit later in the programme. But to Cardiff now, and our Wales political reporter, Teleri Glyn-Jones, who's at the Welsh Parliament, the Senedd, for us. Teleri, farmers have been protesting at the Welsh Government's plans to reform agricultural subsidies. Why are they so angry?
Yes, it's been a very tumultuous week for Mark Drakeford, the First Minister, with protests going on now for a couple of weeks. There's been a real groundswell of discontent amongst the agricultural community right across Wales over plans to overhaul the subsidies that farmers get after Brexit. Over the weekend, there were more protests, more tractors blockading more roads in Newtown in mid-Wales. On Monday, then, Mark Drakeford, the First Minister, held a press conference where he really angered farmers by saying they had to justify receiving public money and couldn't be allowed to do whatever they want with the money that they get from the government's coffers. On Tuesday, then, Mark Drakeford further fanned the flames of the row by seemingly blaming farmers who voted for Brexit for the current situation they find themselves in. That led to this exchange between Mark Drakeford and Andrew R.T. Davis, the leader of the Welsh Conservatives. He's a farmer in the Vale of Glamorgan who supported Brexit.
I ask you again to confirm that food security is a vital part of the proposals and that you will make sure that the food security has that equal weighing with the environmental gains that ultimately we all want to see, and that there will be a rethink on the 10% compulsory tree planting cover that is a demand of the current proposals that are on the table. Because that SFS document that is brought forward will devalue farms, cost jobs and devastate the ability to deliver food that the nation requires for the future.
Well, Llywydd, I think it's important that I remind the Leader of the Opposition why we are in the position that we are in. It's because farmers in Wales took his advice and voted to leave the European Union. That's why that is... Wow, there we are.
Now, further to those comments, on Tuesday, the protests have continued. The First Minister was on a visit in North Wales on Wednesday and was confronted by dozens of farmers and tractors who were booing and shouting as he visited a college, and they followed him in onto the grounds of the college. It's clear that tensions are running very high as the consultation for this sustainable farming scheme draws to a close over the next 2 weeks. But it doesn't seem like that there's any attempt from the Welsh Government at the moment to bring down the temperature of those tensions.
We had Rishi Sunak this week, didn't we, talking up his farming credentials at the National Farmers Union conference in Birmingham, but the Welsh Government was having difficulty getting agreement on its sustainable farming scheme. Just talk us through the issues there.
Yeah, so the main bone of contention is about the level of funding that they get. The Welsh Government have said that it will inevitably be less money than they had from the EU because they don't know how much their budget will be. But the most controversial issue is about the requirement to plant 10% of land with trees and allocate a further 10% for nature habitat. The farming unions have been deeply unhappy, particularly about that requirement for 10% tree planting from the very beginning since it was floated, but the Welsh Government don't seem to want to budge at all on that particular issue. And all of this is in a wider context of rising prices, bovine TB making it very difficult for farmers, and other environmental measures putting strain on farmers' bottom line. According to Plaid Cymru, this top-down approach from the Welsh Government is becoming a bit of a characteristic of the way they operate.
a top-down Welsh Government telling them how to farm whilst being out of tune with what it takes to ensure productive and environmentally friendly agriculture, which is what the sector strives for. Now, yesterday we heard the First Minister telling farmers on one hand that their voice will shape the sustainable farming scheme, and on the other, that it's not up to them how the scheme works. Now, whether it's steel, whether it's hospitality or retail, or it's agriculture, surely the role of Welsh Government is to be leading a partnership.
I am very grateful to over 3,000 farmers who have taken part in the 10 consultation events that we have held on the latest proposals in just the last few weeks. And I know there will be hundreds of others who have taken part in conversations through the farming unions. We are absolutely committed to that way of co-producing with the farming sector, a way in which the very large sum of money that we are committed to sustain for the support of the agricultural community goes on being made available to them.
It's important to say that not all farmers oppose the Sustainable Farming Scheme plans. There is a group this week who've spoken saying they feel really intimidated by these protests and they don't want to openly support it because they're scared of what the reaction will be. But having said that, even some environmental groups have raised concerns about the way the Welsh Government has jeopardised hopes for consensus by alienating so many in the farming community.
And are there any signs that the Welsh Government is going to reconsider the policy?
No, absolutely not, to be honest. They've said they're listening and the consultation continues, as I said, but the tone of the response from the Welsh Government has been change is coming and farming is not immune to that change. But it's hard to overestimate the strength of feeling and that existential threat that many rural communities feel with so many changes on the horizon. The Welsh Government's own impact assessment estimated that 5,500 jobs would be lost as part of this sustainable farming scheme, which is, of course, more jobs than will be lost at Tata Steel, which we've been talking so much about. Another farmer, MS James Evans from the Welsh Conservatives, said he'd been speaking to his constituents about that sense of fear.
All the people that I spoke to are worried, they're scared and they're angry because of the uncertainty around their futures. Rural mental health charities are also being inundated with calls from people who need help and support due to the huge pressures they're currently under because of unrelenting form filling, TB and a government here that seems to ignore their concerns.
Let me begin by recognising that when change happens, people find that challenging. And in rural Wales, there are many changes that are inevitably on their doorstep. They're there because we left the European Union with the security and certainty that that gave to farming here in Wales.
Of course, Mark Drakeford, won't be the leader here in the Welsh Government for much longer. There's a leadership race going on to succeed him at the moment. There was a BBC debate last night between the two contenders, Vaughan Gething and Jeremy Miles. They both admitted that things were very tense. They themselves were actually confronted by farmers as well at a hustings event at the weekend. They both emphasised the need for dialogue. So I guess we'll have to wait to see who wins and to see what happens next if they change direction on this policy.
Teleri, many thanks to Teleri Glyn-Jones in Cardiff Bay for us. Well, to Northern Ireland now, and our political reporter Jim Fitzpatrick at Stormont. Jim, this week saw a big moment, the first question time for First Minister Michelle O'Neill of Sinn Féin, and the first since the Northern Ireland Assembly resumed its sittings after that 2-year gap. How did Michelle O'Neill get on?
Well, as you can imagine, Leila, after 2 years of no government, the public finances and the public services are the issues that many of the MLAs are most interested in. So among other questions, one of the things she was asked about was what was the executive going to do as a priority to fix the finances in this financial year. And it was clear from Michelle O'Neill's answer that even though there was a funding formula put on the table to help the restoration of devolution worth £3.3 billion, it was clear from her answer that she believes that's not enough money. And in fact, she feels that the formula itself needs to be addressed. She referred to it as the fiscal framework.
It's important that we get the basics right in terms of the fiscal framework, so that's why we've identified that, and I'm very delighted that we enjoy cross-party support in terms of making the case for a proper financial arrangement here. That's an ongoing piece of work, and that will obviously have implications in terms of how we fund all the different programmes that we have, whether that's within the Executive Office or across all the other departments. So I've no doubt that over the course of time we'll have much more to say to the member in terms of what that actual budget looks like, particularly as we develop next year's budget.
In terms of laying out the priorities, can I ask what impact the Tory austerity, at least the continuation of the Tory austerity, has on those priorities?
First Minister.
Thank you. And again, I mean, there's no escaping the fact that Tory austerity has badly damaged our public services, and the Executive has clearly outlined serious concerns with our current financial situation. We are funded below need, but as I said, I'm glad that all ministers are united and speak with one voice on the fact that we need to be properly funded here. The Executive has written to the Government and the Treasury and are calling for a discussion on a long-term fund and stability plan. And that needs to be urgent, and it needs to be an ongoing discussion that we need to have with Treasury, because it's critical that we are given the right resources so that we can put our finances on a more stable footing. We have to get this fundamental right.
Now, she mentioned there a letter to the Treasury. The Finance Minister has written to the Treasury objecting to certain conditions being placed upon that money that is now being provided to the Northern Ireland Executive. And one of the things that she's objected to is the need to raise £113 million in this financial year. She says that's not doable. But the Government comes back and says that Northern Ireland needs to raise revenue. And one of the things that we don't have here is water charges. And the Treasury argues that it's because of a lack of fundraising like that Northern Ireland has this shortfall. However, the politicians and all the parties are agreed on this argue back that the formula itself needs to be addressed, and they believe that if the formula was similar to that applied in Scotland and Wales, that more funding for Northern Ireland would be released.
And Jim, there were questions for the first time too, weren't there, for the new Minister for the Department for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs. What came up in his session?
Well, the ecological catastrophe at the UK's largest freshwater lake was perhaps top of the agenda for him. He was asked about Loch Ness, which turned green last summer whenever potentially toxic algae took over pretty much the entire loch whenever it was covered in a kind of green sludge. That even passed through waterways onto beaches on the north coast in Northern Ireland, closing them for days at a time during the peak tourist season. And the Minister had to address that in his questions, and some of the focus has been on the ownership of the loch, the ownership of the loch bed, which under old rules is owned by the Earl of Shaftesbury. However, the Minister was keen to point out that the solution wouldn't be found just in the ownership issue. There were many other things, such as pollutants running off from farms into the loch, that were causing these problems. So he said that finding a solution would need much tougher action across the board.
In approaching the issue around Loch Ness, there's probably three tools we have. One is about education, and that's probably the one we need to divert to first. The other one is about regulation, and the last one's around enforcement. If we're into the game of issuing fines, we've failed. Now, we're probably going to have to move along that because some people aren't going to go with us, but I want to bring people with us in terms of how we can turn the situation around. But I'll be looking for the support of this entire chamber in terms of the plan around Loch Ness. And I would say it's very easy to have discussions around Loch Ness and say how the situation is appalling, but then on the other hand, when we actually have to take really difficult policy decisions, to run away from them. Loch Ness didn't just occur out of the blue, it occurred because generations of environmental misgovernance in Northern Ireland. So we have to recognise that Loch Ness is an example which we want to make sure it never occurs again.
Now, Andrew Muir is the Environment Minister as well as the Agriculture Minister, so he has to champion farmers but also protect the environment. And you get a sense in his answer there that he's trying to ride those two horses when he talks about perhaps failing if you have to go to fines. However, we also heard at Stormont this week evidence in one of the committees from the head of Northern Ireland Water saying that issues around the loch, that there are 70 sewage treatment plants which neighbour the loch, and there are 10,000 septic tanks which are on land close to the loch. And that sector has not had the investment it has needed over recent years. So we come back to this issue of water charges. The parties don't want to impose water charges, but they're going to have to come up with some way of finding money to invest in the system if they're going to address this ecological disaster at Loch Ness.
Jim Fitzpatrick, our political reporter, many thanks for bringing us up to date with events at Stormont. Well, back in Westminster, and this week the Home Secretary, James Cleverly, sacked the independent immigration watchdog. Sean, immigration, tricky area for the government. What actually led to his departure?
So, David Neil, a former senior army officer, was appointed to be the Chief Inspector of Borders Immigration in 2021 for a 3-year term. Now, most of his predecessors had had their terms extended, but he was told that his would not be renewed, and so he was due to leave his post in just a few weeks' time. In the last few weeks, he's been giving interviews and talking to the media, and he's been highlighting various concerns. One of his concerns was that his reports were not being published. He was submitting reports to the government and they weren't being published. Now, just hours before the Home Secretary announced that he had lost confidence in Mr Neil and was basically firing him, we had exchanges in the Commons where an immigration minister came to the Commons and basically denied claims that Mr Neil had made about security at airports.
The security of the UK border is a top priority for me, for the Home Secretary and for the Home Office. Everything we do in this area is designed to reduce risks to this country and its citizens. Border Force performs checks on 100% of scheduled passengers arriving in the UK and risk-based intelligence-led checks on general aviation. It's deeply disturbing that information, which has no basis in fact, was leaked by the independent Chief Inspector to a national newspaper before the Home Office had the chance to respond. We are urgently investigating this breach of confidential information in full, in the normal way.
It's reported today that hundreds of high-risk private flights have landed in the UK without proper border security checks being done. If the Minister disputes the figures, can he tell us the true ones now? Were all the high-risk private flights checked or not? Ministers have been repeatedly warned about border security risks on private flights. The Prime Minister may think it's just all his own mates, but there are real risks from organised crime, money laundering, drugs and weapons smuggling, trafficking and even terrorism. And instead of getting any grip, what's the Minister's response? Just to sack the border inspector and instead sit on his reports. Will he now publish all the outstanding inspectors' reports? And will he tell us, is it true there will now be no inspector in place for the next 6 months?
We will publish those reports and our responses to them. That will happen soon. And when it comes to the questions that she raises around these flights at London City Airport and the information that's been put in the public domain, the Home Office categorically rejects these claims by David Neil. Mr Neil's report into general aviation border checks at London City Airport was submitted last week and underwent fact-checking as is standard practice. Mr Neil was made aware of a specific issue with the recording of data at London City Airport, which meant that a large proportion of flights recorded as high risk should have been reclassified as low risk, and it's disappointing that he's chosen to put misleading data into the public domain.
Accountability and oversight are critical to the effective management of UK border security, and the Home Affairs Select Committee has been repeatedly questioning the government about the delay in publishing the Chief Inspector's reports by the Home Office, and I understand there are now 15 reports outstanding.
When it comes to the laying of the responses from the government to the reports that actually the Shadow Home Secretary asked about as well, as I said in response to that question, this will happen soon.
No firm timeline there from the government for publishing those reports. Sean, many thanks indeed for being with us today. Well, that's all for Politics UK for this week. Politics Live will be back on Monday at 12:15 on BBC Two and on iPlayer. But from all of us here, goodbye.